Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing development in our web application, incorporating what we learned in our last lesson about some new magic methods. One of the things that we do before we get into the magic methods is that we've made all of our object properties and all of the classes in our web application private. So for our customer, our item, and our department classes, we've made all the variables that they have private. Because they're private and we need access to those variables, we're actually going to be defining the get __ get magic method for those classes, as well as a couple of public setters to be able to set some of those private variables. In addition, we've added the toString method to our item and department class, which, as we learned about, is a method of when you use an object variable within a string context, it's your way of basically deciding how you want the object to look as represented as a string. Then we're also going to create a new class called DataFile, which is similar to the one we kind of used in our last lecture, which basically is going to encapsulate all of our file input-output operations. So again, all the properties for our customer, item, and department classes were made private. And because we need to access these different properties, for example, when we're outputting information about an item on item.php, we need to be able to have access to them. So we've added the magic method get to each of these. And what we've done in that get method is just basically provide access to those properties. So for example, it basically just returns the value of whatever property you're trying to access via this name parameter, which we'll see in a second. And then also to our item class, we've added two public setter methods for the item ID and image file extension private properties, so that they can be set from outside the class. And here we're not using the _set method, again, because that allows the creation of additional object properties that we don't want, and we're only providing setter methods for item ID and image file extension because we only want to provide access users to be able to set these particular properties. We don't need them to be able to set description, price, name, because those are set in the constructor, and that sort of falls under the category of data encapsulation, which we talked a little bit about, which is the object-oriented concept of basically having the object control all of the information about its data as much as possible. So if we look at our new classes, let's blow this up a little bit. For example, customer.php, or our customer class. One thing we notice first off is that in our documentation, here we can actually see a list of all of the variables for our customer class, and it actually describes each of them. It says first name represents the first name of the customer. Its access is public. Well, in our new version, we don't have those variables, and that's because they've been declared as private. Because they're private, this documentation is meant for people. Documentation is meant for people that are going to be using your class. Because they don't have access to those variables directly, it doesn't list them on here. So that's one thing to notice. Then also what you can see is, and actually let's just look at the source code for the file. You can see that we've declared each of the variables or the object properties as private. And then we've created our get magic method, and all it basically does is returns the value of whatever private property we're trying to get. And we've also done the same thing for department, which, as you can see, no longer lists a department variables because they're no longer public; they're all private. And we have the same get magic method that just returns the value of the private property, which allows access to it. And basically, item does the same thing. So we've essentially just replicated this in 3 different spots, and we've done so for each class, and that's to make all the variables private, and then also to provide getters to access them. Now, in addition, for our item class, for example, on our add item page in our admin website, when we initially create an item object to insert into the database, we don't know its item ID and we don't know its image file extension yet. So for example, when we call the constructor, we don't have values for item ID and image file extension, so we set them equal to null. So we need ways to be able to set those these now private properties after the object is created. So we've actually created two public setter methods, set image file extension and set item ID. And if we go and look at these, it simply takes the value that we want to set for the image file extension and then sets that the private property equal to that value. And the same thing for the set item ID. It takes an item ID as its parameter, and then sets the private item ID object property to that value. So actually, if we go and look at, actually we don't need to do this. If we go and look at our insert item function, an insert item function is basically what's called from our add item .php page in our admin site that's used to create a new item. And we actually pass it an item object, but it's an incomplete item object. The item ID is missing and the image file extension is missing. So here you can see that what we do is we use a new public setter method that we've defined to set the item ID to the one that we generate or that we get from our last item added file. Our last added file. So here's an example of using that new setter method. For the same thing, we get our image file extension from the name of the image that was uploaded, and then we can set that in our new item that we've created using this new setter method that we have, set image file extension. And this is opposed to, in our last version of this, where we just explicitly access the properties using this accessor because they were public properties. So we could just directly set image file extension and item ID. Now that these properties are not public and they're private, we can't do that anymore. So the other thing that we've done is we've created implemented the two-string magic method for our item and department class. And basically what we've done is previously we've had functions create department data string and create item data string. And those we've been using to take an item object, take a department object, and basically combine them into a delimited string that we store in our items.txt file and our departments.txt file. These functions have been sort of standalone functions in our file library of functions that we've had. Well, now we're actually going to, it kind of in a way makes sense to move them into make them object methods. So for example, because a department object knows all the information about an object, then why not have a method in it that is able to create a string that represents that? Well, to sort of be able to do that, we're going to, and to illustrate the use of the toString method, we're actually going to implement the toString method for both those classes, and it's going to perform the same functionality that these two create data string methods provided. So we're actually eliminating those from filelib.php, and then we're creating toString methods in our item and department classes. So for example, if we look at our older version, we had create department data string, and what that would do is we'd just simply pass it a department object, and then it would go through and build up this string that we store in departments.txt, which is, it's delimited. If you remember, it's delimited by vertical pipes, and then the items in the department are separated by commas. So basically, that just builds up this department string. In the same way, our item data string basically builds up a string that represents the item. And again, we pass it an item object. So we're passing an item object to create a string from that item object. Why not include that in the item object already as a defined method? Because that item object already has access to all the information that we're already passing in. So we're going to make use of the toString method in this case. So if we look at our new item class, for example, you can see we have a toString method. And let's just look at the source code. And in our toString method, you can see it pretty much does the same exact thing as we had in our other version, except that whereas in create item data string, because we passed it a variable that's an item object, we use that variable name to access the different values, to access the different property values of that object. Well, now we've defined toString within the object class, so this is within our item class definition. Now to access these properties, we use the this variable to access them, because, and if you notice, we don't actually have a variable we pass in because we don't need to pass it an item variable, because via this variable, this object method will have access to the properties in the class. So here we basically perform the same functionality, except we use it as a toString method. Same thing happens in our department class. We have a toString method, and it performs the same functionality as in our create department data string method, except it's basically now using the this variable as opposed to the department variable in order to access these different properties. And of course, because these are private properties are accessible within object methods, within a class methods, and so we can use the this variable to access them. So if we actually take a look at how some of these are used, if we look at insert item in the new version, we can see that one of the things that we do is when we insert a new item into our database, we actually create that item data string and insert it into the items file. And actually, in our last version, the way we did that was, this is within the insert item method. We would actually open the items data file, and then we would call this create item data string method, append a new line to it, and then write it to the file. Well, now what we're doing, because we already have this toString method built in, this magic method built into our class now, now we can simply just create an item string that is just includes the variable that represents the item object within double quotes, which means it's going to be used in a string context, which means that toString method is going to be automatically called by PHP. So that toString method that we've now defined that creates that item data string is going to be generated. We append a new line to it, and then we add it to our file. And we're going to talk in a minute about sort of the new method we're using for doing that. Similarly, in our update department method, when we update a department, we basically add new lines or add lines to the department file, or update lines in the department file with new items added to a particular department. And actually, let's look at the previous version. The way we previously did that was we would call create department data string, pass it an object, append a new line to it, and then we'd basically, in this, if you remember, is a way of we'd loop over all of the lines we'd extracted from the file and basically add these department data strings back to the file. Well, in our new version, we don't need to do that anymore. Let's see, and what we can do instead is now, instead of calling create department data string, we just enclose the department, the variable that represents our department object within double quotes, and append a new line to it. And now that's going to implicitly, again, call the toString method that we created for department. It's going to create that department data string, and then we're going to be able to go ahead and add it to our particular file. So probably one of the biggest things that we did in this new version of the web application is we created a new class called DataFile. And basically what its purpose was to encapsulate all of the file operations that we've been doing, because in all of our different methods that we've had, and this is similar to the, we kind of introduced this concept a little bit in our lecture on magic methods, where we introduced the DataFile class during the lecture. Basically, if we look at, for example, our last version of the web application, we have all these functions within our file library, most of which access a file. They open a file up, they read from it, they open a file up, they write to it, they close the file, and so forth. So there's a lot of similar operations going on here. We actually even have 3 separate functions. For example, open departments data file, open items data file, open last added file. And all of these different functions, now let me just look at the source code. All of these different functions essentially perform the same thing. If we look at the code for open department data file, and then we look at the code for open items data file, the code looks almost exactly the same. So anytime we, sort of our rule is if we have code that we're reusing over and over, the same code, why not put it in one spot and be able to reuse it? By putting this code in a single class, we can take advantage of reusing that code. That's going to eliminate making mistakes, because now, let's say anytime we want to change how this operation works, we have to change it. For example, in this case, we might have to change it in 3 different spots because we have 3 different methods that are used to open files. Now we can put this open operation, this open method, within our new data file class, and we can, anytime we want to change how we open a file, we can just do it in that one spot. So what we're essentially going to be doing is, for every file that we're going to be accessing or opening, we're going to be creating a data file object that's going to basically represent access to that particular file. So in our new version, we're actually going to be getting rid of all 3 of these open departments data file methods. And what that's going to do is, for example, like one of the things that we do is they all use the fopen method. They all also output an error message and return false. For example, if there's an error opening the file. Now we can put that same functionality into one place, so we don't have to replicate this in multiple spots. The other thing is, for example, if we go to getItem, our old getItems file function, we have our opens items data file, which we just discussed as our way of opening a file. Then we manually loop over all of the lines in the file looking for, actually let's look at the items exist one, that might be a better example. We manually loop over all of the items in the file using this feof method and fgets method to try and find a particular item in a file. Well, for example, if we look at the department exists file, you're going to see it looks very similar. So what we're going to do is basically put this file access, this feof call, this fgets call, all into this data file class that we're going to create, and we're going to create a method, for example, called nextLine that's going to allow us to read the next line from a particular file. So again, this is taking code that we've used in multiple spots, and we're going to put it in one class. So let's actually go and take a look at this new class that we've created, data file. Oops. First off, it has 3 different private properties. One is access mode, one is file handle, and one is file name. Access mode and file name are basically the name of the file that this object is going to represent, because this object is going to basically allow us to perform operations on a file. File name is going to be what file it's going to be performing the operations on. Access mode is going to be how we're going to be opening that file. Are we going to open it in append mode? Are we going to open it in overwrite mode? Are we just going to open it for reading? And you can set both of these. Our constructor is actually going to take both a file name and access mode, so we can set them. And then we also have a file handle property, which is used internally within the class. It's not accessible outside of this data file class. And so what it's going to do is when, for example, the way you use a data file object, actually let's look at the slide for this. The way you typically, or the way that you use a data file object that we've created is you instantiate the object, you provide it with a file name and an access mode. Then you call the open method that we provided, that's provided by this class. You perform some operations on it, such as, for example, getting the next line. We'll also see that there's an append line method we've created. And then when you're done, you call the close method that's provided. So if we go and look, for example, we can see that there's a close function that's provided, which basically closes a connection to a file. Let's see what the other one. There's an open file, an open method that allows you to open file, and basically that encapsulates all of that code that we saw before for opening a particular file. And then we have other methods such as, actually look here, we have a method append line, which is going to allow us to append a line to a file. We have a function getLine, which is going to allow us to read the next line from a file, and then a function getLines, which is going to allow us to pull an array containing all of the lines in the particular file. So basically, we have this private file handle that gets created by our open method. If we look down at the open method, you can hopefully see, I don't know why the color is not working on this one, that we have an fopen method that gets called within this open function, and basically what it does is it sets this private file handle object property equal to the file handle generated by fopen. And fopen is just going to be called on the file name that we've set for our particular file that this object represents, and we're going to open it in the access mode specified. And again, both of those were able to be specified in our constructor. Our constructor takes the file name in the access mode, does a little bit of error checking. It tests to make sure that file name is actually is a valid file, or is a valid file name, and if so, it sets file name equal to that. Otherwise, it sets it equal to null. It checks to make sure that access mode isn't empty, and if it isn't, it goes ahead and sets it equal to the empty string if it is empty. Otherwise, it sets it equal to the value passed in. And then as part of our always initializing all of our object variables in our constructor, we initialize the file handle equal to null. And that's because when the user calls the open method, that's going to allow them the ability to set that, essentially set that private file handle variable, and that's going to be created by the get open method. So let's take a look actually at this class in action. If we look at our get item function, for example, and this data file class is basically used in all of our functions within our file library that have access to a file. And we don't have time to go over all the examples of it. They're documented in the change log for this web application, but we're going to go over a couple of the different examples so you can see how this new data file class is used. So for example, in our get item class, that's where we're trying to load an information about a particular item from a file based on, from our items text file based on an item's ID. Well, the first thing we do is we create a new data file object. The name of the file is going to be the name of this constant items data file, which is something that we set in our config file, which ends up being a path to items.txt. We're going to open it. We're going to set that this file, when it gets opened, it'll be open in read mode. Then what we do is we perform the public operation, or the public method open on this file. And open returns true or false based on whether or not the function is able to successfully open a connection to the file specified by the file name parameter of the data file constructor. And so what this is also going to do is, as we had talked, the open method is going to set that file handle object property of our data file class. So now when we run other operations on our on this data file class, they'll be able to access that file. So for example, the thing that we do in this particular function is we loop over each of the lines in the file, reading a line and extracting information to see if it matches the item ID that we're looking for. So here, after we've opened the file and now we have a valid file handle, we're actually going to be calling this next line function that we've created in our data file class. Just open this up in another window. And if we look at our next line class, basically what it does is it says if it's not at the end of the file, if it's at the end of the file, return false. There's no more lines to read. If it's not, it says to go ahead and get the next line of the file. It uses the fgets method, and it operates on this private variable file handle that was set by the open method, and it accesses it via this variable because it's a private method, and it's actually anytime you access a object property within a object method, you use this variable. So basically what we do here is we loop over while this still returns a line, because what's going to happen is next line is going to return false when it reaches the end of the file. Then it's going to kick out a loop. While it's still returning next line, we're basically going to, this performs the same functionality as it does before. We're going to be pulling out the first data field from a particular line, checking to see if it's the same item ID that we're looking for. If it is, then we're going to be building up an item object using our build item object function, and then that's what eventually gets returned. Down here we sort of finish our operations by calling this close method on items data file on our data file object. And if we look at the close method, we can see that basically what it does is it calls fclose on the file handle that we have that's open, assuming that the file handle has not already been set equal to null. Because one of the things that we do is when we close the file handle for this particular object that's a property of this particular object, we also set it equal to null. And that's also for use in our destructor, which we created in this class, which we're going to talk about in a second. And we talked a little bit about that in the last lecture. So basically, the close just method just checks to see if it's not, if the file handle is already null. If it is, it just returns true because the file is closed. Otherwise, it it goes ahead and closes the file, and then it will output an error, for example, if there's an error in closing the particular file. So basically that's how using a data file class, this new data file class works. You instantiate an instance of it with a file name and an access mode. You call the open method on it to open a connection to the file that you specified in the constructor. You run operations on it. For example, in this case, we're performing a read operation, which is read next line, and then you call the close method on it. The other method that this class provides is called getLines, which basically returns an array of all of the lines, an index array where each value in that indexed array is a line of the particular file. So for example, we use this with our get departments file. We read all of the lines from the departments file. So to use this we use this in our get departments function. We create a new data file that says it's going to represent the department's data file. When we eventually open it, we're going to open it in read mode. We open the file, and then we call this getLines method on it, and basically it's going to pull an array of all the lines in that data file represented by this departments.txt file, and put it in this lines variable. And then basically this function still performs the same operations it did before. It goes through and it checks to find excuse me. It goes through and it builds a department object for each data line that it gets from that file. And down here you can see we finished the operation with the close method. The one other method that we provide in this class is the next line method. And basically what this method does is, not next line, append line method. Basically what it does is it takes a string that we pass to it and it appends it to the file that this data file object represents. So what it does is, one thing it does is it tests to see if the line, because it's appending a line, lines have new line characters at the end, it basically tests to see that the line that you've passed in when you call this method has a new line. If it doesn't have a new line, it adds one to it. And then after it does that, it goes ahead and calls the fwrite method, which operates on the private file handle object property, and then just basically writes that line to the file, and then it returns true or false whether that was successful or not. We use this in our insert item function when we insert a line in our items.txt file. So here in our insert item function, we can see that we create a new data file object. We open the items data file in append mode, or we set it to open in append mode. We open the file, and then we actually use this append line method to append the new line to the file. And then we call our items data file close method to sort of finish the process. So that's how that data file class that we've had works. And basically, it takes all of this sort of, in a way, common operations that we've had spread out through different parts of the code, encapsulates it in a single class so that we can reuse it in multiple spots. Now, one other thing to note is that our data file class, we've actually added a destructor to it, the destruct method, which is a magic method in PHP, as we learned. And we use our destruct method to make sure that when this object is no longer being used, that it closes any open files. Let's say, for example, we had said that the typical procedure for using a data file object is you instantiate it, you call the open method, you perform some operations on it like append line, and then you call close. Let's say that somebody that's using our object doesn't call this close method. Well, when that script ends, or when that items data file variable gets set to null, the destructor is going to be called. And the destructor, basically what it's going to do is it's going to test to see if the file has already been closed, and it does that by testing to see if the file handle is null. And if it isn't null, then it goes ahead and runs its own object method close, which, as we saw, basically calls fclose on the file, and then sets the file handle equal to null, which is how the destructor knows if a file has already been closed or not. So basically, our destructor just makes sure that the file was closed so that we don't have a file left open. And so that's an example of using a destructor, and it's similar to what we used in our in our last lecture. So for today's homework challenge, really like you to just study the data file class, as it's somewhat of a complex class. We're really starting to get more into our object-oriented programming. We've got constructors, destructors, we've got magic methods. where using private object properties. So this data file class sort of incorporates a lot of that different stuff. So make sure you can understand the class and how it works, and specifically understand how that it's being used within our, for example, our file lib functions, because a lot of functions within that file lib, and again, they're spelled out in the changelog, are going to make use of this data file object because they're performing a lot of file operations. So this is going to be used in multiple spots. And then also just be sure to understand about how you understand, to make sure you understand how the destructor works and how that ensures that when a data file object is destroyed, that it makes sure that any files it had open were closed beforehand, which is important for closing. You want to always close your file resources. And so that's, for example, to make sure, and it's a way of sort of keeping things clean, to make sure that if your user didn't explicitly call, for example, the close method on a data file object, that it'll go ahead and still be closed anyways. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.